So everybody has tea, and you, Dr. Diana, you don't have one, so there you go. And it's really interesting because we have one doctor, two doctors, three doctors, and like nothing. So, like today, when we say the word Sharia, like people just like look at you as if you...
They're terrified.
If you
They're
sinned,
terrified,
right?
yeah.
There's historical Sharia, which means the collective inherited tradition of the practiced legal system from the beginning of Islam to the entry of the colonial period. It's a normative system about what would God want from a human being. The whole idea of Sharia is that God cares and that God wants the best for what God created.
Well, but also Sharia law is even more generous for somebody who is pregnant than in America right now.
Right.
A person who's pregnant can have an abortion at any point if their life is in danger.
I think that the whole notion of a Sharia that terrifies people of God is an oxymoron. I mean, if the whole point of Sharia and the end result is that people become alienated from God and scared of God and, in fact, hate God, like we see in a lot of Muslim countries, unfortunately.
By the way, Dina doesn't have an understanding of what Islamic law or Islamic practice or philosophy is like, and so she's so committed to this idea as the law is the only central point of justice making. Part of the story is an exploration into the contradictory and moral inconsistencies of our legal system that is very disenchanting for Dina because...
But what do you think she's motivated by? Is it faith? Is it the system?
I think she thinks that is a mechanism to seek justice.
Absolutely.
But most people who do use the law know it's part of an overall strategy of resistance. It's not the only way that we can practice justice. And so, but she has a narrow focus. And now she's giving somebody's hopes up, and she gets a brutal awakening from the person at her law firm that says, Dina, this is not realistic. This is not what the law can do. Maybe she could get her U visa in a couple of years, but that's not going to save her child who has cancer. And so it's hitting her very deeply because the illusion of justice is now evaporating before her eyes.
You know, a lot of laws are created because of power. White-collar crimes tend to affect many more people, and yet the sentencing is often less than other crimes where it's individual crimes. So I'm not so sure that there's ever a point in which we can say that law is moral. It's based on power.
There are laws that are instituted that we would consider immoral, and then laws that the dominant power institutes and breaks at its will. I'll give you an example. So the US government has come into 500 treaties with Native Americans, and they have violated or outright broken all of them.
Oh, yeah.
So why did you choose
Law?
Yeah.
For Palestine.
Uh-huh.
I was very young, and I went to Palestine for the first time from Canada. I was very deeply moved by what was happening, and I thought, I want to be a lawyer.
Okay.
And I want to work for Palestine. I was very young and naive, and I now obviously realize that the law isn't going to liberate Palestine at all. It's just yet another tool that oppressors use.
When did you realize this, and what practice did you do as a lawyer or as someone knowledgeable of the law to get to that, result, basically, that this is not exactly what's going to liberate Palestine?
It took me a long time. Because I was involved in the political process, I kept thinking that somehow if the world just listened to Palestinians, if international law was just followed, then Palestine would be free. And along the way, I learned that it's not just a question of the world listening to Palestine. There's a problem with law itself. And the problem with law itself is that it favors nation states. It doesn't favor refugees. Law doesn't speak to these types of situations, nor can it ever.
So do you regret that?
No, I don't regret it at all. It's, I wish I had learned it when I was younger.
Have you lost faith in international law and human rights law? I mean, do you not
International
believe
law
in
is
it?
the saddest of all laws.
International law really is the saddest.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I teach public international law, and I struggle this with the law students who are, you know, obviously, you can't tell them, you know, start your career being defeated, but if we don't have public international law, where do we go?
We go to communities. There's practices that are starting called transformative justice, where communities are trying to take mediation into our own hands and not use the instruments of the law or instruments of the carceral state, like the courts or the police. And so there is now being designed a process of mediation. I mean, even in our tradition, sulha, which is peacemaking, as opposed to arbitration, which means authoritative judgment or settlement, right? Like, what does it mean if you actually shift the lens or frame of what it means to seek justice?
When you put a state ahead of people, then you're always going to be in a place where you can justify behavior that is immoral.
Okay.
This is the beginning of our conversation. So, for example, if you look at the way that today war is not practiced in the same way that it was in at the beginning of the last century. So how do you begin to get into a place where you have a system of laws that deals with drones? The law is always behind, and it's only for me when we put people first rather than states first, rather than the nation state first, that I think we'll see some change.